We are in Daniel, and we did a lot of background information last week, kind of set the stage, if you will. And so today we're going to get into this first chapter of Daniel, Daniel 1. Just a couple of things that I'll say about Daniel, and then by chapter 2, I think that the stage is really set. There's a strong and significant difference in Daniel from most of the Old Testament. And I'd said before we started studying this that Daniel is a great book because it's Old Testament, but it's a bridge to the New Testament. Maybe one of the strongest bridges from Old Testament to New Testament. And along those lines, what we see is that Israel is peripheral to the story. The rest of the story, prior to this, Israel is front and center, God's chosen people. And you can see God working and doing all that he does in his life. But there's a problem for the Christian age for us from that standpoint. Not a problem, but a significant difference. And that is that we see in the Christian age that godly people, followers of the great Jehovah, are a minority in even a, what do you call that, anti-culture or subculture, if you will, and are not a political force. Right, that is creating this atmosphere. Sometimes we get a little sidetracked and try and make this, but we're not creating this little sub-terrain, if you will, or polygeographical area where it's all about us. What we are and are meant to be, as Daniel's going to point out as we go further, is a minority impacting the world. And so Israel's not center stage, but rather peripheral. Secondly, we see something kind of unique to the story to this point, although we've seen hints of it. Daniel, Shadrack, Meshach, and Abednego, which we'll talk about those names in just a few moments, aren't fighting against the Babylonian Empire, they're working for it. I get asked this question all the time. How can I work for an ungodly corporation? Right? How can I pay taxes to a government that does XYZ? Uses my tax dollars to do this, that, and the other. Daniel gives us the answer. He very early on is presenting a stage. These individuals worked within the government, for the government, and enhanced the government. Although they weren't the first, were they? Moses kind of gives us a glimpse of that, a little different, but Joseph certainly already laid this pattern down for us. And so we get that picture of what God's people are supposed to be doing and how they can do when they're in the minority. Secondly, what we see by Israel being in the peripheral is that God is sovereign. God is sovereign. I think this is a message that we need to hear loud and clear today. There is so much fear about where the world is going. We're going to talk tonight about Saul and fear, so I encourage you to be with us tonight if you're able for that message. And there's several reasons for that. One of which, we have 24-hour news networks now. Brad, when you, Sean, and I were kids, it was sufficient, and I hated to labor through it, an hour or two a night, right? And that was terrible time, because the adults commandeered the TV for the news program. Well, now we've got 7, 8 news programs 24/7. There's not more going on. And here's what Fox and CNN have in common. There's a lot of differences, right? They're both peddling fear. The news isn't so much about informing as it is instilling fear. That's my personal opinion on why there's so much fear today. But here's what I do know, that the message that is needed, regardless of the cause, is that God is sovereign and God is in control. You see, it was easy for Israel to know God was in control when he's parting the Red Sea and the Jordan and all these amazing things and hand-walking his people through there and creating a nation. But now they've been exiled. Now they are captives and slaves and possibly eunuchs in foreign government. And where is God? By chapter 2, we're going to see God is center stage. Always. He's in control.
He's trying to teach his children that they get their life straight. So just because he's not doing certain things that day, he's there.
Okay? Yeah. God's sovereign. He's there. He's in control. Right? And so Daniel comes at a low point. A low point for the Israelite people, for the people of God, where they're in utter despair, no hope. And Daniel enters the stage, and he shows loud and clear, God is with us, is in control. So these individuals are not working against the Babylonian government, but rather for it. And one of the things that I want to point out, the last prerequisite to the study is that the answer in difficult times is always loyalty to God. Or in Daniel's case, to the Torah, to the law. Here's what Daniel is showing. All this stuff has changed around me. All the things outside my control have went in a horrible direction. So what do I do? Back to that question. How do I work in an ungodly company, in an ungodly country, in an ungodly work atmosphere? And you could probably add numerous things to it. The answer is to act godly. That's what Daniel shows. Counterculture was the word I was looking for earlier. It was there, just submerged under a bunch of other stuff. Questions or comments before we get into chapter 1? All right, chapter 1. I am going to quickly outline this chapter, tell this story, if you will, so that then we can read it and break it down into parts. Nebuchadnezzar's come into Jerusalem. He's taken not only holy things out of the temple, he's besieged it and mostly destroyed it, and eventually utterly destroys it, but he's taken all these holy things included or for the purpose of worshiping God, and he's taken it to his pagan gods. Babylon is a phenomenal city. If you study about Babylon, it is phenomenal. We're going to see in chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar is the golden head on the image representing manly reign. And history shows us that is true. This city was incredible. It was beautiful. It was ahead of its time. And so he brings the best of the Israelite people to Babylon. For this purpose, he's going to culture them in Babylonian culture and religion and loyalty, and then use the best minds to help guide the kingdom as they go forward. These 4 individuals, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are not the only four individuals. They're just center stage early on in the story here. And so the king is preparing them. And one of the first obstacles that they say no to, it's not their first obstacle, it's the first obstacle they say no to, is partaking of the king's foods. And we'll talk about why that is as we go forward. Daniel approaches the head of the eunuchs, says, can we do this another way? The eunuch says, you'll get my head chopped off. Daniel says, give me 10 days and see what it's like. They do it 10 days. These four individuals excel. At the end of the story or end of the chapter, we see that they're 10 times better than everyone else. And that is setting the stage. Here's a question I have for you, though. I think we can understand, maybe underestimate, yet understand how difficult it was for these individuals to do this. And they've got a long road ahead of them. The question that we're going to start to see answered in chapter 2 is how can they continue to do this? And I think that's important in a time where burnout and discouragement is an all-time high right now. Statistically, we're seeing things along those lines that we've just never seen before. Chapter 2 will answer how do you continue to do what's done in chapter 1 to be that counterculture. Questions or comments? All right, would someone kindly read 1 through 7 for us, please?
In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
And Alvin for your input. That really helps. So, in the third reign of Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar comes and besieges the city. Here, I think, is challenge number 1. The Israelite people counted on God to protect them. However, they had not upheld their side of the bargain. And so think about the challenge that takes place. They are destroyed. I think also, and I used that term polygeographical earlier, and poly referring, poly many, but theogeographic is what I'm getting at. The concept in the Old Testament that we see, and this is put forth in Scripture and in culture, that what took place is gods were in control of areas. So their religions were related to their physical place. So think about this from the Hebrew standpoint. God gave them a promised land. He said, this is going to be our place, and I'm going to roll all of that. I think it's Numbers 32 where we see God's allotting the land, but he keeps Israel for himself. And if you look at a lot of the battles in the Hebrew history, what would happen is they'd go down into the valleys and they would defeat the pagans. And then the pagan kings, they would regather and they'd say, okay, their God defeated us in the valley, but let's see how he does in the hills where our God's strong, right? And so there's this strong connection between the two. And what takes place is, in their mindset, is the God, from the Babylonian viewpoint, the God of Babylon, which they had 4,000 in their pantheon. By this time, we're going to see later in the story, Marduk is the chief of gods because he has rescued all the other gods. Marduk leads them, if you will, to the place of the Israel God and defeats them. I think we need to give serious contemplation to how challenging that would have been to the faith of the Israelites. Now, pause there for a second, because this thought process might be taking place, or it should be if you're thinking through it. Hold on, Israel was already unfaithful, that's why they're being conquered. We're thinking of it from a macro standpoint, from a zoomed out standpoint. Now think about it from Daniel's standpoint. Do you think Daniel had been unfaithful prior to the exile? No. If he had, there's no way he'd be standing up the way he was. There was always a remnant, Scripture calls it, a portion of the people who were faithful. So consider this from Daniel's standpoint. I'm speaking, giving a sermon some point in the near future entitled Dare to be Daniel. Consider it from Daniel's standpoint. He's been faithful. Everything around him in his culture has collapsed and corroded, and now he's conquered and taken to this other land. Terrible challenge. Terrible challenge. I think worth pointing out is Daniel's not just strong because times are bad. Daniel stands out in times that are bad because he was prepared. He was strong prior to this. So Babylon conquers Jerusalem. And to just prove that their gods are greater, they go into the temple and they take these holy things. And they take them to their place. That's going to come back up in chapter 5, if you recall. I encourage you to read through Daniel, and especially chapters we're going to look at each week in advance. But this comes back up in chapter 5, these things they're taking out of the temple. Challenging, right? Questions or comments to that? I made a statement last week that raised a lot of eyebrows, and it's funny because it's interesting, so I mean to say, because I have some perspective from so many conversations I've had that one of the things that surprised me is eyebrows were raised from different perspectives for different reasons, knowing so many of you. But here was the statement I made that no one seemed to like. America is in power, the U.S. is in power because God put them in power. Boy, everyone's... Russia's in power because God put them in power. There's the part people get really uneasy with, right? And we could go to Scripture to show that, but here's what I want to look in chapter 2, gets deep into that, so we're saving that for chapter 2. But here is what really takes place. Do you see how I framed this earlier? The Babylonians came and conquered Jerusalem. Scripture doesn't quite frame it that way, does it? How does Scripture frame it, verse 2?
To the Babylonians' hands.
Say that again, Lord.
The Lord gave the king of Judah into the hand of the Babylonians.
The Lord gave. I encourage you to underline that, highlight it, do whatever you do to make it stand out. Because that phrase is 3 times in this chapter alone. When you start to see something repeated over and over, radar should be going up. Sometimes we read our Bibles as flat words on the page, and they're much, much deeper than that. It's a phrase that's going to be repeated throughout the entire book. We're in Daniel chapter 1, by the way. It's good to see you. So the Lord, here's what's taking place. It had been prophesied, and now the Lord has given Jehoiakim, meaning Jerusalem, into the hands of the Babylonians. Daniel, Shadrack, Meshach, and Abednego are in Babylon because that's where God intended them to be. Because of their own unrighteousness? No. For things that are much bigger than them. Much bigger than me. Much bigger than you. Questions or comments on 1 and 2? Verse 1 and 2. Verse 3. Now we start to get to some serious challenges, I think. The king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch. Now, it was prophesied to Hezekiah, we looked at this last week, that Hezekiah's descendants would be eunuchs in the courts of Babylon. There's a lot of argumentation whether Daniel and his friends are eunuchs, physical eunuchs. And the argument against that seems to be Deuteronomy 23:1 says that you can't come into the temple, into the congregation if you're a eunuch, so they couldn't possibly be a eunuch. That, if you believe that, I don't mean, that just holds no water to me whatsoever. That's the whole point. They've been conquered. They've been utterly defeated. At least what is certain is that they are essentially eunuchs, if not physically eunuchs, because they've been taken out of their culture, out of everything. I mentioned about this bridge from the Old Testament into the New Testament. This is why we start to see ingrained in the ideology of Scripture that we're going to see later prophets say that God accepts and makes whole the eunuchs. Is it Acts 8? One of the very first specific converts to the church we see as a foreign eunuch, right? I think we're getting to some very deep concepts here. How broken Israel is, God's people are, and how much God is going to do to bring them back. Fred. I'm not quite following you there. Yeah, those vary somewhere between 15 to 25, you know. So I'm not quite following what.
I figured maybe he wasn't making because he was so young. Anyway.
I would suggest 15-year-old's most important to make a eunuch, if that's your concern. But I think to be graphic, we're an adult Bible saying, and those who aren't adults are young enough to not be concerned. The point of puberty is, becomes important. A lot of these culturally, a lot of these boys were castrated prior to puberty to prevent the hormonal changes to take place. So a lot of them that sang in the courts of the kings were castrated before their voices started to change, so their voices did not change, those sorts of things. So, graphic enough? Cruel enough? Whether Daniel was or was not a physical eunuch, we've got to wrap our minds around just how difficult a situation this was. This is what Daniel's been thrust into at a rather tender age, right? That, I think, is certain. So, verse 4, these individuals are, physically without blemish. They're intelligent beings. They've been picked for this particular purpose. Now, verse 5 gets into this idea of the foods. Someone give me some ideas. Why were they not to eat, did not want to eat the king's foods? Unclean. Meaning they would have been animals that they were not permitted to eat under Jewish religion. Meaning they would have been prepared in unkosher. We're familiar with that term today, right? Even if we're unfamiliar with its meaning, they would have been prepared in unkosher ways, right? And so, absolutely, unclean. Any other reasons? Wine.
Was it might not have been fruit of the vine, like per se, we take on this morning. It might have been a wine that was, how do you, I don't know what the process is called.
Fermented?
Yes.
Yeah, and this is, we're probably going to get into, I don't know how far, I don't want to go down this road today because it'll get us off topic, but wine was not absent from the Hebrew diet whatsoever. I think we're going to get to why that's an issue, the wine. It's connected to the others. So that's interesting because some of these other things are not part of our diet. And now we've got something that is part of our diet, and we're going to completely abstain from that as well. So why would that be? What would have taken place with all of these things prior to being served? Okay.
If it's not blessed by the rabbi, it isn't kosher.
Okay, and that's getting into some today's cultures, but kosher actually, at this time, would have meant that it was prepared correctly. Not touched by unclean hands, not strangled. So, again, Mike, that does get into some things we've incorporated today, but biblically, we're on a right page here. At this time, not everything they ate would have been blessed by a rabbi. But you're on to something there. It wasn't blessed by a rabbi. What was done with it?
Probably offered to idols and things like that, or used part of their worship of some sort.
Absolutely. And so you were, Mike, right there on the verge. The wine and the foods alike. And these are the dainties of the king. So it's not just talking about exotic food that the commoners couldn't afford. That is part of it. It's talking about food that was most powerful and blessed and used in idol worship. So things would be sacrificed to idols. Paul deals with this much later in Scripture, the exact same things going on. And then served, in particular in these places, to the king. Why? Because the concept was that you were receiving the power of that God by partaking of this food. Does that make sense? And that is what these four men say, no. No.
From either by eating that. Daniel asked just for vegetables and called it mush, but he didn't want to eat that meat or drink that wine because it would defile them. And they didn't want to do that, so he just told the eunuch just to give them the vegetables, and they actually, what do you call that, looked better than the ones that was eating the meat and drinking the wine. They even looked better than them by what they ate.
Yeah. So, a couple of things.
Here. Number one, there's different interpretations of what, or ways of interpreting that word. Literally what it means, vegetables or so on, is that which is harvested. So vegetables doesn't quite cut it. And there's other translations that don't quite cut it. It's a hard thing to translate. That which has been harvested is what literally it means. So wheat would have been part of it, you know, breads, all these things, that which would have been harvested. Something interesting, Bob, and you said it would not have been nourishing to them. These things are being used specifically because they were nourishing. They were very good physically for all these people. That's why they were being, it was the best of the best. But I think you were spot on, because what is good for the Babylonians is not good for Daniel. It's maybe a good lesson to get our heads wrapped around. It was not going to be nourishing to Daniel. It was going to defile him. That doesn't mean that these foods wouldn't help everyone else to grow and to be strong. The fact that they're 10 times better really has very little to do with the fact they ate vegetables. We're not promoting a vegetarian diet here, although some have used this chapter to say that. But when you look at the Hebrew diet, that's just not supported. They're abstained. So, Bob, I think you're absolutely right. Would not have been nourishing to these 4 individuals. That's worth noting, that difference. Just because it's good for someone else doesn't mean it's good for me or for the people of God. Great idea. All right. I want to talk about the 3 challenges here. I was kind of foolish. I'm always foolish, but I really thought we'd handle this whole chapter. There's a lot of great messages here. I think they're applicable and helpful. And this chapter is setting the stage for the rest of the book, though. So I haven't made my excuses. Consider the 3 challenges. And they didn't stand up. They didn't decline all the challenges. Number 1, they were to be taught in the Babylonian court. That is a sort of compromise. Why? Because they're being subjected to pagan sciences. Now, the Babylonians were amazing. Number 1, they knew about the Pythagorean theorem 1,000 years before Pythagorean lived. Right? Like, you're real familiar with the Pythagorean theorem, right? Some of you out there are like, what? That's a squared plus b squared equals c squared, right, Mike? What it really means is build the building square, right? So that when you get to the roof, not everything's cattywampus. The point is, they had a lot of, in so many ways, they understood so much. But the other side of this was they were looking at animal intestines to decide what the gods were going to do. They were looking at the stars. We still publish this in our newspaper. But they're looking at the stars to see the correlation between the stars and what happens in human lives. You know, these things are very counter and against the Hebrew religion. Notice they didn't stand up to that. They didn't say, nope, can't teach me. Not going to hear it. This argument's made about colleges and public schools today, and I'm not, if you abstain from those, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. No way am I saying that. Here's what I am saying. I think the reason they didn't, well, I know for sure, is they didn't take that stance. It was a significant challenge to their faith, though. I think the reason they didn't is because they could simply use godly wisdom and say, wow, that's great. This is no good. What we know is they didn't take a stance against it, but I think we have to admit it's a serious challenge, right? Number 2, pagan names. Isn't this interesting? I don't have the answer to this. We know Daniel by his Hebrew name, and in the other 3 we know by their Babylonian name. I don't know why, just because we're people, right? Daniel means God is my judge, or deliverer is really what judge is getting at. God is my deliverer. Belshazzar does not mean that. Hananiah means gracious is Jehovah. Mishael means who is he that is God? And Azariah means Jehovah hath helped. And what's interesting is their Babylonian names. I didn't write these down, and I'm not smart enough to remember them all, but the Babylonian names are plays and mocking their Hebrew names, giving value to the Babylonian gods. Mentioned earlier, there's 4,000 of them at this time. I got 3 people named here, 4 people, so we don't get them all. We don't get them all in there. Significant challenge to their faith, right? They don't stand up against that one. Here, I think, is an important aspect to that. What you say about me doesn't reflect who I am or how God sees me, for the good or the bad. Mike, he's a wonderful person. Emily was a little confused. One day I went down to see her, and she says to me, do you know Mike Smith? I said, yeah, and I already told her who I was, and they'd just taken her tube out just within an hour prior. She says, and she talked about what a wonderful person I was. She's talking about a different person, right? What you say about me, this is hard to grasp with social media. What you say about me is not who I am or what God sees me as being. Right? Now, we talked about the foods. They said, here's the line. Why? Because now I've got to compromise me to take that step. In a world full of complicated situations, I find those challenges and how they dealt with them to be incredibly helpful. Questions or comments as we conclude? Thank you for your attention. Lord willing, next week we will not start in chapter 2. We'll start in verse 8 of chapter 1. Thank you for your time.